you and I are both fans of history, so let's step back. We've been talking about the future. Let's step back for a bit and look at the 90s. You created Mosaic web browser, the first widely used web browser. Tell the story of that. How did it evolve into Netscape Navigator? This is the early days.
So, full story. So,
you were born.
I was born a small child.
Well, actually, yeah, let's go there. Like,
No,
when did you first fall in love with computers?
So I hit the generational jackpot, and I hit the Gen X kind of point perfectly, as it turns out. So I was born in 1971. So there's this great website called WTF happened in 1971.com, which is basically 1971 is when everything started to go to hell. And I was, of course, born in 1971. So I like to think that I had something to do with that.
Did you make it on the website?
I don't think I made it on the website, but hopefully
somebody needs to add. This is where everything.
Maybe I contributed to some of
wrong.
the trends.
Yes.
That they do. Every line on that website goes like that, right? So it's all a picture disaster. But there was this moment in time where, because sort of the Apple II hit in like 1978, and then the IBM PC hit in 82. So I was like 11 when the PC came out, and so I just kind of hit that perfectly. And that was the first moment in time when like regular people could spend a few $100s and get a computer, right? And so that I just like that resonated right out of the gate. And then the other part of the story is, I was using an Apple II. I used a bunch of them, but I was using Apple II. And of course, it said on the back of every Apple II and every Mac, it said, designed in Cupertino, California. And I was like, wow, Cupertino must be the like shining city on the hill, like Wizard of Oz, like the most amazing like city of all time. I can't wait to see it. And of course, years later, I came out to Silicon Valley and went to Cupertino, and it's just a bunch of office parks and low-rise apartment buildings. So the aesthetics were a little disappointing, but it was the vector, right, of the creation of a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
So then basically, part of my story is just the luck of having been born at the right time and getting exposed to PCs. Then the other part is when Al Gore says that he created the internet, he actually is correct in a really meaningful way, which is he sponsored a bill in 1985 that essentially created the modern internet, created what is called the NSFNet at the time, which is sort of the first really fast internet backbone. That bill dumped a ton of money into a bunch of research universities to build out basically the internet backbone, and then the supercomputer centers that were clustered around the internet. And one of those universities was the University of Illinois, where I went to school. And so the other stroke of luck that I had was I went to Illinois basically right as that money was just like getting dumped on campus. And so as a consequence, we had on campus, and this was like 89, 90, 91. We had we were right on the internet backbone. We had like T3 and 45 at the time, T3 45 megabit backbone connection, which at the time was, wildly state of the art. We had Cray supercomputers. We had thinking machines, parallel supercomputers. We had Silicon graphics workstations. We had Macintoshes. We had Nextcubes all over the place. We had like every possible kind of computer you could imagine because all this money just fell out of the sky.
So you were living in the future.
Yeah. So quite literally, it was, like, it's all there. It's all like we had full broadband graphics, like the whole thing. And it's actually funny because they had this is the first time it sort of tickled the back of my head that there might be a big opportunity in here, which is, they embraced it. And so they put like computers in all the dorms, and they wired up all the dorm rooms, and they had all these, labs everywhere and everything. And then they gave every undergrad a computer account and an email address. And the assumption was that you would use the internet for your 4 years at college, and then you would graduate and stop using it. And that was that, right?
Yeah.
And you would just retire your email address. It wouldn't be relevant anymore because you'd go off in the workplace and they don't use email. You'd be back to using fax machines or whatever.
Did you have that sense as well? Like what you said, the back of your head was tickled. Like what was exciting to you about this possible world?
Well, if this is so useful in this contained environment that just has this weird source of outside funding, then if it were practical for everybody else to have this, and if it were cost effective for everybody else to have this, wouldn't they want it? And overwhelmingly the prevailing view at the time was no, they would not want it. This is esoteric, weird nerd stuff, right? That like computer science kids like, but like normal people are never going to do email, right? Or be on the internet, right? And so I was just like, wow, like this is actually like, this is really compelling stuff. Now, the other part was it was all really hard to use. And in practice, you had to be basically a CS. You basically had to be a CS undergrad or equivalent to actually get full use of the internet at that point, because it was all pretty esoteric stuff. So then that was the other part of the idea, which was, okay, we need to actually make this easy to use.
So what's involved in creating Mosaic, like in creating a graphical interface to the internet?
Yeah, so it was a combination of things. So it was like basically the web existed in an early sort of described as prototype form. And by the way, text only at that point.
What did it look like? What was the web? I mean, and the key figures, like what was it like? What? Paint a picture.
It looked like ChatGPT, actually. It was all text.
Yeah.
And so you had a text-based web browser.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the original browser, Tim Berners-Lee, the original browser, both the original browser and the server actually ran on Next cubes. Mm-hmm. So this was the computer Steve Jobs made during the interim period during the decade-long interim period when he was not at Apple. He got fired in 85 and then came back in 97. So this was in that interim period where he had this company called Next, and they made these computers called cubes. Mm-hmm. And there's this famous story. They were beautiful, but they were 12-inch by 12-inch by 12-inch cubes computers. And there's a famous story about how they could have cost half as much if it had been 12 by 12 by 13. But Steve was like, no, like it has to be. So they were like $6,000 basically academic workstations. They had the first CD-ROM drives, which were slow. I mean, the computers were all but unusable. They were so slow, but they were beautiful.
Okay, can we actually just take a tiny tangent there?
Sure, of course.
The 12 by 12 by 12, that just so beautifully encapsulates Steve Jobs' idea of design. Can you just comment on what you find interesting about Steve Jobs? What about that view of the world, that dogmatic pursuit of perfection, and how he saw perfection in design?
Yes, I guess they say, look, he was a deep believer, I think, in a very deep the way I interpret it. I don't know if he ever really described it like this, but the way I interpret it is it's like this thing, and it's actually a thing in philosophy. It's like aesthetics are not just appearances. Aesthetics go all the way to like deep underlying meaning, right? It's like, I'm not a physicist. One of the things I've heard physicists say is one of the things you start to get a sense of when a theory might be correct is when it's beautiful, right? Like, right. And so there's something, and you feel the same thing, by the way, in like human psychology, right? When you're experiencing awe, right? There's a simplicity to it. When you're having an honest interaction with somebody, there's an aesthetic, I would say, calm that comes over you because you're actually being fully honest and trying to hide yourself, right? So so it's like this very deep sense of aesthetics.
And he would trust that judgment that he had deep down, like even if the engineering teams are saying this is too difficult, even if the finance folks are saying this is ridiculous, the supply chain, all that kind of stuff, this makes this impossible. We can't do this kind of material. This has never been done before, and so on and so forth. He just sticks by it.
Well, I mean, who makes a phone out of aluminum, right?
Yeah.
Like, nobody else would have done that. And now, of course, if your phone was made out of aluminum, how crude, what a kind of caveman would you have to be to have a phone that's made out of plastic? Like, right? So, so it's just this very right. And look, there's 1,000 different ways to look at this, but one of the things is just like, look, these things are central to your lives. Like, you're with your phone more than you're with anything else. Like, it's going to be in your hand. I mean, this. He thought very deeply about what it meant for something to be in your hand all day long.
Yeah.
Well, for example, here's an interesting design thing. Like, he never wanted. My understanding is he never wanted an iPhone to have a screen larger than you could reach with your thumb, one-handed. And so he was actually opposed to the idea of making the phones larger. And I don't know if you have this experience today, but let's say there are certain moments in your day when you might be like only have one hand available, and you might want to be on your phone. Yeah. And you're trying to like send a text and your thumb can't reach the send button.
Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons, right? And then there's like folding phones, which I would love to know what he thinks about them. But I mean, is there something you could also just linger on, because he's one of the interesting figures in the history of technology? What makes him as successful as he was? What makes him as interesting as he was? What made him so productive and important in the development of technology?
He had an integrated worldview. So the properly designed device that had the correct functionality, that had the deepest understanding of the user, that was the most beautiful, right? Like it had to be all of those things, right? He basically would drive to as close to perfect as you could possibly get, right? And I suspect that he never quite thought he ever got there, because most great creators are generally dissatisfied. You read accounts later on, and all they can see are the flaws in their creation. But like, he got as close to perfect each step of the way as he could possibly get, with the constraints of the technology of his time. And then, look, he was, sort of famous in the Apple model. It's like, look, they will, this headset that they just came out with, like, it's like a decade long project, right? It's like, and they're just going to sit there and tune and polish and polish and tune and polish and tune and polish until it is as perfect as anybody could possibly make anything. Yeah. And then this goes to the way that people describe working with him, which is, there was a terrifying aspect of working with him, which is, he was very tough. But there was this thing that everybody I've ever talked to who worked for him says, that they all say the following, which is we did the best work of our lives when we worked for him, because he set the bar incredibly high, and then he supported us with everything that he could to let us actually actually do work of that quality. So a lot of people who were at Apple spend the rest of their lives trying to find another experience where they feel like they're able to hit that quality bar again.
Even if it, in retrospect or during it, felt like suffering.
Yeah, exactly.
What does that teach you about the human condition, huh?
So look, so I'd say exactly. So the Silicon Valley, I mean, look, he's not, George Patton in the, in the Army, like, there are many examples in other fields, that are like this. Specifically in tech, it's actually, I find it very interesting. There's the Apple way, which is polish, and don't ship until it's as perfect as you can make it. And then there's the sort of the other approach, which is the sort of incremental hacker mentality, which basically says ship early and often and iterate. And one of the things I find really interesting is, I'm now 30 years into this, like there are very successful companies on both sides of that approach, right? Like that is a fundamental difference, right, in how to operate and how to build and how to create, that you have world-class companies operating in both ways. And I don't think the question of like which is the superior model is anywhere close to being answered. Like, and my suspicion is the answer is do both. The answer is you actually want both. They lead to different outcomes. Software tends to do better with the iterative approach. Hardware tends to do better with the sort of wait and make it perfect approach. But again, you can find examples in both directions.
So the jury's still out on that one. So back to Mosaic. So what? It was text-based.
Yeah.
Tim Berners-Lee.
Well, there was the web, which was text-based, but there were there was like 3 websites. There was like no content. There were no users. Like it wasn't like a catalytic. It hadn't, and there, by the way, because it was all text. There were no documents. There were no images. There were no videos. There were no, right. So it was, and then if in the beginning, if you had to be on a Nextcube, right, you need to have a Nextcube both to publish and to consume. So there were
$6,000. You said
there were limitations. Yeah, $6,000 PC. They did not sell very many.
Yeah.
But then there was also FTP, and there was Usenet, right? And there was a dozen other basically. There's Waze, which was an early search thing. There was Gopher, which was an early menu-based information retrieval system. There were like a dozen different sort of scattered ways that people would get to information on the internet. And so the Mosaic idea was basically bring those all together, make the whole thing graphical, make it easy to use, make it basically bulletproof so that anybody can do it. And then again, just on the luck side, it so happened that this was right at the moment when the GUI sort of actually took off. And we're now also used to the GUI that we think it's been around forever, but it didn't really, the Macintosh brought it out in 85, but they actually didn't sell very many Macs in the 80s. It was not that successful of a product. It really was when you needed Windows 3.0 on PCs, and that hit in about 92. And we did Mosaic in 92, 93. So that sort of, it was like right at the moment when you could imagine actually having a graphical user interface to write at all, much less one to the internet.
How old did Windows 3 sell? So was that the really big?
That was the big bang.
The big graphical operating system.
Well, this is the classic. Okay, Microsoft was operating on the other. So Apple was running on the polish it until it's perfect. Microsoft famously ran on the other model, which is ship and iterate. And so, the old line in those days was Microsoft. Right, it's version 3 of every Microsoft product. That's the good one, right? And so there are you can find online Windows 1, Windows 2. Nobody used them. Yeah. Actually, the original Windows, in the original Microsoft Windows, the windows were non-overlapping. Yeah. And so you had these very small, very low resolution screens, and then you had literally Windows. It just didn't work. It wasn't ready yet.
Well, and Windows 95, I think, was a pretty big leap also.
That was a big leap too. Yeah. So that was like bang, bang.
Right.
And then of course Steve, and then in the fullness of time, Steve came back. Then the Mac started to take off again. That was the third bang, and then the iPhone was the fourth bang.
Such exciting time.
And then we were off to the races.
Because nobody could have known what would be created from that.
Well, Windows 3.1 or 3.0, Windows 3.0 to the iPhone was only 15 years. Right? Like that ramp was, in retrospect, at the time it felt like it took forever, but that in historical terms, like that was a very fast ramp from even a graphical computer at all on your desk to the iPhone. It was 15 years. So.
Did you have a sense of what the internet will be as you look into the window of Mosaic? Like what? There's just a few web pages for now.
So the thing I had early on was I was keeping at the time there's disputes over what was the first blog, but I had one of them that at least is a possible at least a runner up in the competition. And it was what was called the What's New page. And it was like hardwired, and I had distribution unfair advantage. I put it right in the browser. I put it in the browser, and then I put my resume in the browser, which also was
hilarious.
But I was keeping Not many people get to do that. So
No.
the
Good call.
Yeah,
Man, early
exactly.
days.
Yes,
It's so interesting.
I'm looking for my about. Oh, Mark is looking for a job.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Wow.
so the What's New page, I would literally get up every morning and or every afternoon, and I would basically, if you wanted to launch a website, you would email me, and I would list it on the What's New page, and that was how people discovered the new websites as they were coming out. And I remember because it was like it literally went from, it was like one every couple days to like one every day to like two every day. Boom, boom, boom. And then
So you're doing, so that blog was kind of doing the directory thing. So like, what was the homepage?
So the homepage was just basically trying to explain even what this thing is that you're looking at, right? The basically basic instructions. But then there was a button. There was a button that said "What's New," and what most people did was they went to, for obvious reasons, went to "What's New."
Yeah.
But like it was so mind blowing at that point. Just the basic idea, and this was like, this is the basic idea of the internet, but people could see it for the first time.
Yeah.
The basic idea was, look, it's like literally, it's like an Indian restaurant in like Bristol, England, has like put their menu on the web, and people were like, "Wow,
whoa!"
Because like that's the first restaurant menu on the web.
Yeah.
And I don't have to be in Bristol, and I don't know if I'm ever going to go to Bristol, and I don't even like Indian food, and like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it was like that. The first streaming video thing was it was another England thing, some Oxford or something. Some guy put his coffee pot up as the first streaming video thing, and he put it on the web because it was the coffee pot down the hall.
Yeah.
And he wanted to see when he needed to go refill it. But there was a point when there were thousands of people like watching that coffee pot because it was the first thing you could watch.
But
right.
Isn't were you able to kind of infer, if that Indian restaurant could go online, then you're like,
they all will.
They all will.
Yeah, exactly.
So you felt that already.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, look, it's still a stretch, right? It's still a stretch because it's just like, okay, is it, you're still in this zone, which is like, okay, is this a nerd thing? Is this a real person thing?
Yeah.
By the way, there was a wall of skepticism from the media. Like they just like, everybody was just like, yeah, this is just like dumb. This is not, this is not for regular people at that time. And so you had to think through that. And then look, it was still hard to get on the internet at that point, right? So you could get kind of this weird bastardized version if you were on AOL, which wasn't really real, or you had to go like learn what an ISP was. In those days, PCs actually didn't have TCP/IP drivers come pre-installed, so you had to learn what a TCP/IP driver was. You had to buy a modem. You had to install driver software. I have a comedy routine I do. Something's like 20 minutes long, describing all the steps required to actually get on the internet at this point. And so you had to look through these practical. Yeah. Well, and then speed, performance, 14.4 modems. Right. Like it was like watching, glue dry. And so you had to, there were basically a sequence of bets that we made where you basically needed to look through that current state of affairs and say, actually, there's going to be so much demand for that. Once people figure this out, there's going to be so much demand for it that all of these practical problems are going to get fixed.
Some people say that the anticipation makes the destination that much more exciting.
Do you remember progressive JPEGs?
Yeah. Do I?
So for kids in the audience, right?
For kids in the audience.
You used to have to watch an image load like a line at a time, but it turns out there was this thing with JPEGs where you could load basically every fourth. You could load like every fourth line, and then you could sweep back through again. And so you could like render a fuzzy version of the image up front, and then it would like resolve into the detailed one. And that was like a big UI breakthrough because it gave you something to watch.
Yeah, and there's applications in various domains for that.
Exactly. Well, there's a big fight. There was a big fight early on about whether there should be images on the web. And
for that reason, for like sexualization.
No, not explicitly. That did come up, but it wasn't even that. It was more just like all the serious. The argument went. The purists basically said all the serious information in the world is text. If you introduce images, you basically going to bring in all the trivial stuff. You're going to bring in magazines and all this crazy, just stuff that people it's going to distract from that. It's going to go take the way from being serious to being frivolous.
Well, was there any doomer type arguments about the internet destroying all of human civilization or destroying some fundamental fabric of human civilization?
Yeah, so those days it was all around crime and terrorism. So those arguments happened, but there was no sense yet of the internet having like an effect on politics, because that was way too far off. But there was an enormous panic at the time around cybercrime. There was like enormous panic that like your credit card number would get stolen and your life savings would be drained, and then criminals were gonna. There was when we started, one of the things we did, the Netscape browser was the first widely used piece of consumer software that had strong encryption built in. It made it available to ordinary people. And at that time, strong encryption was actually illegal to export out of the US. So we could field that product in the US. We could not export it because it was classified as a munition. So the Netscape browser was on a restricted list along with the Tomahawk missile as being something that could not be exported. So we had to make a second version with deliberately weak encryption to sell overseas with a big logo on the box saying, do not trust this, which it turns out makes it hard to sell software when it's got a big logo that says don't trust it. And then we had to spend 5 years fighting the US government to get them to basically stop trying to do this. But because the fear was terrorists are going to use encryption, right, to like plot, all these things. And then, we responded with, well, actually, we need encryption to be able to secure systems so that the terrorists and the criminals can't get into them. So that was the 1990s fight.